Marianne Williamson, what motivated your desire to run for president?
Well, I think for myself, but I think for a lot of people. Once Donald Trump was elected president, nothing was the same. I don't think I'm the only person who's thought about what we're going to do with our lives now was somewhat shifted after the election of the president. And I think that made all the difference in the world. Yeah.
In terms of the job, though, to head up the executive branch, it's probably one of the most complicated jobs in the world. So what makes you prepared for it?
Well, it's interesting that you say it's complicated, because I think what's missing in the way the presidency certainly is currently being, the powers currently being exercised, doesn't have to do with the area where it's complicated, but with the area where it should be far more simple. FDR said that the primary role of the president is moral leadership. He said administrative aspect is secondary. There's a moral equivocation that we see too much in politics, including in the presidency these days. So what has prepared me is 35 years working up close and personal with people whose lives are in crisis. I have seen what it takes to move from crisis to transformation and opportunity, and I've also seen very up close and personal the effects of bad public policy on people's lives. So I have a lot of passion for what has gone wrong. I think a lot of clarity for what has gone wrong. And I think sometimes it's politicians who don't seem to exercise as much moral certitude about what has become so deeply corrupt in the U.S. government. You know, I understand people talking about experience. Very experienced politicians led us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians led us into the war in Vietnam. Very experienced politicians got us to where we are. So I challenge the idea that only those who have had careers entrenched for decades in the limitations of the mindset that drove us into this cliff are qualified to lead us out of it. I think that what we're missing in our government is an alignment with the deeper democratic and humanitarian values that truly do make this country great. And in a country that is, in a government that has been so corrupted by the undue influence of money, what you see is far too much compromise among our political officials with the donors and with all of the advocacy for corporate power. And so as a consequence, I feel that what we need is someone who has more experience dealing with the kind of effects that this craziness has had on people, the kind of certitude about what it will take to make things right.
Based on that, how would you approach the presidency? Specifically, how would you structure the chain of command and how you would operate inside the White House?
The chain of command, that's not the problem. I mean, the problem, once again, it's moral certitude. So you have someone who is your chief of staff. Like any business, you know, the inside of the White House has a certain kind of infrastructure. That's not the problem. You know, we act like this is something so different from every other aspect of life. It's not that different from every other aspect of life. What we need in a president is someone with moral clarity, moral conviction about how undue influence of money has corrupted our government and hijacked our value system. A president who understands that public funding for federal campaigns is absolutely necessary. A president who understands that the undue influence of money is the cancer underlying all the other cancers. A president who stands for federal legislation and ultimately a constitutional amendment that would establish public funding for federal campaigns. A president who understands we should repeal that 2017 $2 trillion tax cut where 83 cents of every dollar went to the very richest individuals and corporations. A president who understands we should put back in the middle class tax cut. A president who understands we should stop those corporate subsidies such as $26 billion to the oil and gas companies last year alone. A president who understands that, hello, the U.S. government should be able to negotiate with Big Pharma for lower drug prices on behalf of the American people. A president who understands that while the military should get every dollar that they need for legitimate security concerns and that they say they need, that we should not be spending the hundreds of billions of dollars on top of that, which have to do only with short-term profits for military contractors. We need a president who understands that, no, you do not ignore millions of chronically traumatized children, millions of American children who go to school every day in classrooms that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And that if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased and the chances of incarceration is drastically increased. And a president who understands that we have millions of American children who psychologists say are experiencing a level of PTSD that is no less severe than some veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, who understand that we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children, who understands that every school in America should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. We need a president who understands we need to go much deeper into a conversation about race in this country, because a country, just like an individual, can't have the future we want unless we're willing to clean up the past. And a president who understands that the dominance of the military-industrial complex on our national security agenda is an absurd and an absurdly dangerous road for the next 50 to 100 years, because you can't just back up into peace. You can't just endlessly prepare for war. You have to proactively wage peace. Those are the things which we need in a president. That's what we need in a president. Someone who has principles and an alignment of moral certitude and recognizes how off-center, how off-course our democracy is with our democratic principles and our humanitarian principles. If it has taken my experience to take me to that place, being able to lay that down like I said, then that's the qualifications that apparently we need.
Well, you put a lot there. So what shaped those principles? Why are you a Democrat? Where did you come up with, not come up with, but the areas that shaped your ideology?
I was raised in a home where, you know, if you said to my father, I don't care what year it was, if you said to my father, who'd you vote for, Daddy? He'd say, FDR, Roosevelt. I was raised, remember, I'm old enough to remember Bobby Kennedy. I'm old enough to remember I was a child when Martin Luther King died. I was a child when when Kennedy died. But I was old enough to understand that here were people who held aloft in the public domain the higher philosophical and human desires that we had within politics. And what happened for my generation is that those men were literally shot and killed in front of our eyes. And something very profound happened at that moment, because in a very real way, the message of those assassinations was meant for an entire generation. And that message, though unspoken, was very clear. You will go home, there will be no further protest. And after the assassinations of the Kennedys and Dr. King, then there were also the assassinations of those students at Kent State. So we were told to just go back into the private sector, do whatever we wanted, but to leave the public sector to whoever wanted to control it so bad that they were obviously willing to kill in order to do so.
And who's controlling it?
Well, whatever and whomever. I mean, I certainly don't think it was just Sirhan Sirhan. Nobody thinks it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. It was something bigger going on there. And the point is what was stopped. And I believe that after that, many of the people seeking higher philosophical ideals sort of depoliticized, and people seeking political change became so over-corporatized in their alliances and in their languaging. But I've always lived with both. I've always lived within myself in a place where you seek to be a better person and you seek to be a better citizen. I've always seen politics from an integrative place, that it's both policy, it's the public domain, and it's the private self and the private domain. That's why I've been very active in the nonprofit sector, et cetera, and a political activist, and a spiritual writer, and speaker. So I believe at this time our politics has become too disconnected from who we are as people. I don't think the American people lack soulfulness. I think we're good people. I think we're decent people. I'm a fan of the American. I'm not saying we're better than other people, but we're good, decent people. But what has happened over the last few decades is that the conversation, the inquiry into what it means to be a good person, what it means to be forgiving, what it means to be merciful, what it means to be just, what it means to live with compassion and integrity, has been too circumscribed within the limits of the personal self. We should ask not only, is my behavior good? We should ask, is our country's behavior good in Yemen? We should ask not only, am I in integrity? We should ask, is our tax policy in integrity? I believe that's what citizenship is. And I believe that this country was founded on the notion that this is everybody's business, not just a political class. That's relatively new, this sort of aberrational idea that there's a political class. That's just another idea of elite aristocracy almost. This country belongs to all of us. None of us have a monopoly on truth, and all of us should feel invited to weigh in.
So based on all of that, though, you have got to navigate through the political parties, through the congressional system, through the committees, through the politics of Washington. So how do you take those ideals and turn it into practicality?
Well, once again, the main role of the president, in my opinion, and I believe in the opinion of FDR and other great American presidents, is to articulate a vision for the country, a moral vision for the country, and to communicate that to the American people. This is the problem I have with conventional politics today. The people have become spectators. The people are looked at like poker chips. It's just a game that politicians play. They look at citizens like we're just poker chips. How many do you have? How many do you have? I believe the main relationship of the president should be with the people of the United States. That is what I want to be president for, to help navigate this country through a very turbulent time in our history. We need a season of repair. And I think somebody needs to be very deeply honest with the American people about the level of corruption that exists here and how dangerous our future, the dangers that we risk by not changing course, politically, socially, and economically. We already have a system where a very amoral economic system has so corrupted our government that we have 1% of Americans who own more wealth than the bottom 90%. We have a government that does more to advocate for short-term profits for huge multinational corporate interests than it does to advocate for the health and the safety and the well-being of the American people. That's why we have the largest income inequality in almost 100 years. That's why we have 40% of Americans who live with chronic economic anxiety. We have the millions of American children that I was telling you about. We have children whose despair has simply been normalized because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. They're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. So how can they possibly compete with all the clout of the corporate money that dominates this town of Washington? That's why I want a Department of Children and Youth. I want to pay reparations for slavery because I understand that this is the turbulence of race relations in the United States is such that we should take a serious next chapter in seeking to deal with this, and also we need to heal the wounds of injustice towards Native Americans.
But with regard to reparations, who do you pay and what do you pay? How do you know what to give them?
My plan is for $200 to $500 billion to be dispersed over a period of 20 years. The money would be dispersed to a reparations council. The reparations council, let's say 50 people perhaps, who would be made up of black leaders, obviously themselves descendants of American enslaved persons, from an array of academia. There's a gentleman, a professor at Duke University named Sandy Darity, who's done a lot of work on this, Ta-Nehisi Coates, people like that, political leaders, leaders from culture. And the idea is that the stipulation on the part of the U.S. government would be that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. It might be, they might choose historic black colleges, venture capital for black businesses. There are many kinds of ways, and the decision should be made by this council as long as it is within the stipulation of economic and educational renewal. This is not a debt, this is an asset. This will be a benefit to the U.S. economy, remember. You know, CBS did a study recently that if black families produce the same amount of wealth, and we're talking about the fact that a black person of the same level of educational achievement, the same level of professional achievement, makes less money than a white person statistically in America. If they made the same amount, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. So when you're talking about this kind of dispersal, look at that compared to the $2 trillion tax cut, where 83 cents goes to the top earners and corporations under this idea that they're going to be the job creators and the money is going to trickle down. After 40 years, clearly, we can see where that got us. So when I talk about this, not only is it the morally correct thing to do, you know, Germany after World War II paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Now, this doesn't mean that the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. So the reason I want reparations as opposed to just race-based policies is that reparations carries an inherent mea culpa. So it carries moral force. It is an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of people to pay it. My experience, and I've been talking about this for many, many years, my experience is not that the average American is a racist, because I don't believe the average American is a racist. But I do believe that the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. And what I find, even in the whitest states in the United States, is that when you talk to people about the first slave ships landing in 1619, slavery not abolished till 1865, that's 250 years of slavery, followed by another 100 years of institutionalized violence against black people in America. The fact that at the end of that 100 years, you had the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation. You had then the Voting Rights Act, which ensured equal access to the polls, although we're chipping away at that now. Then what you see is that the economic gap that was obviously there at the end of the Civil War was never closed. It was, the level playing field was never created. And we are still living with the legacies of this. In some ways, we're even sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Our criminal justice system, racial disparity, it means we're sliding backwards. I'm running for president because I don't want us to just carry this over and over. It's time for us to do some great things now in order to end one chapter of our history and to begin another.
Let's talk about you. After the first debate, you were the most Googled of the candidates, 20 on the stage. You were not in the third debate. What do you think people learned about Marianne Williamson?
Well, after the second debate, and I was given much less time than most of the contenders also, but like you said, I was the most Googled person in 49 states. I think that's hilarious, by the way, because the state that didn't Google me the most was Montana, which I found hilarious because their governor was on. So apparently people in Montana went, who is he? The governor. I laugh every time I think about that. I think there was a lot of interest after the second debate. And then within 3 days, the political hits certainly started. She's anti-science. She's anti-medicine. She's crazy. She's a grifter. And I think it certainly dampened the enthusiasm, put just enough suspicion in enough people's minds. Unfortunate.
You've been described as spiritual but not religious.
Well, I don't know if that's really true about me. I'm a Jew, and I'm not, you know, when they say a religious Jew, usually what that means now is more Orthodox, which I'm not. But I think of myself as a religious woman, actually, as well as a spiritual woman.
I have to ask you, after Hurricane Dorian, you said that it could be deterred by using the power of the mind. You got a lot of criticism for that. So what did you mean?
Well, I tell you, I had just been several days before in Georgia and South Carolina. You think they weren't praying for God to turn that thing around? Do you think that was stupid people praying to God? I mean, what is this? Is this like if you pray, that means you're less intelligent? Or if you pray, you don't believe in medicine? Or if you pray, you don't believe in science? If you pray, you're somehow... Do we really want to mock that? Is that really where we want to go? And particularly for those of us who are Democrats who would really, really, really want to win in 2020, you think mocking people because we believe in the power of God is a good way to go? You think? I don't think so at all.
Who influenced you the most growing up?
My father. My father was like a cross between William Kunstler and Zorba the Greek. Imagine that. That was my dad. My dad took us to Vietnam. I was in Saigon when I was 15 years old because my father wanted us to see what war was. I had come back from school, dinner one night. I was in the 7th grade. And I told my parents that my social studies teacher had said that if we didn't fight in Vietnam, we would be fighting on the shores of Hawaii. It's called the domino theory. That was what we were all being told, that we had to fight to stave off the communists in Southeast Asia. And my father stood up, sweetheart, that's what he called my mother, get the visas, we're going to Vietnam. Those bastards, he said, that military-industrial complex is not going to eat my children's brains. That's the kind of parents I had. They took us traveling all over the world. They were world travelers, and during the summer, we would travel, and people would say to my father, why are you taking your children traveling so much they won't even remember? And he would say, it will get under their skin. And he was right. I'm a different person than I would have been, because as a child, I saw people are the same everywhere. I saw that as a child. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. So there's so much propaganda that I don't think I was ever vulnerable to, because as a child I had seen otherwise.
So he would not be surprised that you're running for president of the United States?
I don't know about the surprise part, but I do think he'd say, "Go, little sister." He had said to me when my career began, he said, "What happened to you? I raised you to change the system," because he was an immigration lawyer, very involved in social justice. So when my career began, I was writing books about love, and giving talks about love and faith. My father said to me once, "What happened to you? I raised you to change the world." And I said, "I think love is the way to change the world, Daddy. It's the ultimate revolution, is revolution of the heart." And he heard me. He heard me. So what I'm doing now is the same thing I've been doing for 35 years. What I've been doing for 35 years is talking about how principles of mercy and kindness and love and compassion are the only guide to right living, and that when you follow those principles, life works. And when you don't follow those principles, chaos ensues. They are unalterable laws. Just like if I drop this cup, I know it will hit the ground. Now, the fact that I know it will hit the ground, you don't look at me and say, "Oh, it's so touching how faithful she is in the law of gravity." No, I just know the law of gravity. Well, there's certain unalterable laws of the internal world as well. And if you live seeking right relationship with people, you seek to live in integrity and be decent and good by people, you have a fair shot at a life that works. If you don't, you're going to have some problems. But I believe this is true in our collective experience as well. And I believe that as citizens, we are responsible for concerning ourselves with those, whether or not those principles prevail within our public policy, domestic and international. That's what happens in a democracy. The people get to weigh in.
You have written how many books?
14.
In one of the books, there's a quote, and I frame this in terms of 2020 politics, going back to what you said earlier. Love is what we're born with. Fear is what we learn. What do you mean?
Well, I believe that we're all filled with a divine spirit. All men are created equal. Notice the Declaration of Independence doesn't say all men are equal. It says all men are created equal. And then it says God gave all men inalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. In God we trust. I mean, this idea that there is a divine source to all this is, whether people see this in secular terms or religious terms doesn't matter. I mean, we're a religiously pluralistic nation, and that means the freedom not only to worship as you wish, but whether you wish. But the very idea that something is going on here beyond just flesh and bone is central, I believe, to the greatness of this country. Crown thy good with brotherhood. This idea, it's not just about money. It's not just about economics. It's about possibility for human beings. That's what the founding of this country was about. This country was founded on the notion, which is not just profound in political terms, but also profound in philosophical and moral terms, that here we would have a country where, to the best of our ability, we would create a society where anybody could soar, that there would be no external shackles. And our love of that idea, and our love of each other, and our love of the earth, and our love of our grandchildren, no generation should live only for itself. If we take those moral ideas and we apply them only to the personal self, but not to the collective self, what you get is what we got, and we're in trouble.
When you're on the debate stage with a mayor, senators, governors, a former vice president, what's going through your mind?
You know, I have a lot of respect for the people on the stage. I have a lot of respect for mayors. I have a lot of respect for governors. I have a lot of respect for senators. But they should have a lot of respect for spiritual teachers. They should have a lot of respect for clergy. They should have a lot of respect for authors. They should have a lot of respect for artists. Hello, there are different estates in this world. You know yourself. Let's say your job. There's no way you think that there are Congress people out there who are thinking more deeply about the issues in America than you are. They have their time. They're raising money. Come on, what are we pretending for? Ooh, senators and congressmen. I've known enough senators and congressmen, so have you, sir. You know, I mean, those particular ones I have a lot of respect for, but what are we talking about here? this illusion, this like Wizard of Oz thing, like something's going on behind the curtain, and then what was really behind the curtain. So what I'm thinking is these are fine people, and I'm glad to be here, but I certainly don't feel, because I don't buy into the illusion that they are deeper thinkers necessarily about what goes on in this country. Like I said, very experienced politicians led us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians acquiesced to that. Not that those did, but I challenge the idea that only those, that group of people, not this particular, they're lovely people who are running, don't get me wrong, but, you know, political mechanics, we need a political visionary right now more than we need a political mechanic. I think that's my point. Everybody talks about the political mechanics, the political mechanics. That's not where we're lacking. And you can have the best political car mechanic in the world, but you don't say to the car mechanic, do you know the road I should take to Cleveland? They're two different skill sets, and that's where we're lacking. So as much I have great respect for political expertise, if I'm President of the United States, I will certainly be bringing them in. But I'm clear about what the vision is of where we're going, and that's where this country is so off course.
And your view of the current president, Donald Trump, is what?
I think he's a dangerous man. I think that this man has no visceral taste for democracy. I think he lacks respect for our democratic traditions. I think that his policies are run against the grain, not only of our democratic principles, but our humanitarian principles. And I believe the prospect of another term is chilling.
Two final points. What do you think would surprise voters the most about you, your life, your background, and or your career?
Well, it's interesting because I believe that recently with all this, she's anti-science, anti-medicine, whatever that craziness is, there's this picture, this mischaracterization of me as crystal lady or whatever.
Address that. Why do they say anti-science?
Nothing I've ever said or written has been anti-science. Nothing I've ever said or written is anti-medicine. This was a political hit, and I think anybody can see that who looks into it.
Do you think you can win?
Well, Donald Trump is president. I think that if I were truly heard and seen by the American people, I absolutely do believe I would be a major contender. With the, hits that they throw at you, and they certainly have thrown at me, plus I'm not an establishment figure, plus I do not have the kind of money that others have, it's very difficult to get your narrative out there, to get your story out there, because you have 3 field organizers and somebody else can have 99 or whatever. I hope your listeners will go to Marianne 2020 if they wish, see what I say about the issues and donate if they wish. My heart told me to do this. And my heart tells me to be here with you today. I read a book many years ago by a man named Arnold Patton. And it said, if you genuinely have something to say, there's somebody out there who genuinely needs to hear it. I'm talking about what an amoral economic system has done to this country. I'm talking about millions of traumatized children and how their trauma and their despair is being ignored. I'm talking about race at a deeper level. I'm talking about our need for World War II massive mobilization around climate change, climate crisis reversal. And I'm talking about our need for a Department of Peace, our need to actually declare peace, wage peace, both domestically and internationally. I'm talking about the need to have a Department of Peace so that we don't just treat the symptoms of violence and war, but actually look deeper at the things we need to do to create a more peaceful world. I'm 67 years old, and when I turned 50, someone said to me, a girlfriend said to me, 50 is the age past which you don't care what other people think anymore. And I found when I turned 60, it's the age past which you gotta say it. There are some things that need to be said in this country. There are some things that need to be said in this country. And there's no platform like a presidential campaign. So I'm out there and I'm saying it. Now, whether or not the American people vote for me, that's in the hands of the American people. But as long as I'm running, I can honestly know they have this option.
And finally, this experience, you are a novice running for the highest office in the land. So what's it been like for you personally?
Novice. I'm not an, you know, maybe I'm a...
As a candidate.
Yeah. What is the experience like? It's a difficult experience, and I think it's difficult for every candidate. I feel a lot of compassion for the other candidates because every day I know they're doing this too. They're doing the same thing. It's an emotional roller coaster. There are interviews like this where someone is doing their job and there's journalistic integrity and you're very grateful because you have the opportunity to give your views. And then there are other experiences that are just the cheapest, lowest type of erosion of what our culture should be. And to stand in the midst of all that and to be experiencing both, it's like exhilaration, brutality, all in one day. But I tell myself, there's a chance you'll win. And if you become president, this will have been good rehearsal.
Marianne Williamson, we thank you for stopping by.
Thank you. Thank you very much.